This week on Quadriga, bloodshed in Syria as the world looks on. Tanks have again been deployed to the city of Hama. The Syrian regime is continuing to order attacks upon its own people, ignoring protests from around the world. The attacks so far are estimated to have killed more than 200. But people continue to take to the streets. Following tough negotiations, the UN Security Council has issued a statement demanding an end to the violence. Your host today is Terry Martin.
Hello and welcome. How far will the Syrian regime go to suppress the uprising? Why is the international community so reluctant to get involved? What are the prospects for political change in Syria? Those are some of the questions we're talking about this week on Quadriga.
Joining Terry Martin in the studio, Michael Stürmer is the chief correspondent for the German daily Die Welt. A political historian, he is a specialist in foreign affairs and security issues. Christine Hellberg is a freelance journalist covering international relations with a focus on the Middle East. For most of the past decade, she was posted as a foreign correspondent in the Syrian capital, Damascus. Salam Said is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. Originally from Syria, she is focusing on global affairs and economic change in the Arab world.
Now, the situation in Syria is quite, indeed, it's very serious. Estimates are that between 1,700 and we're hearing now 2,000 people may have been killed there since the uprising began back in March. What are the protesters demanding? Do they share a common cause, Kristen?
Well, when it all started in mid-March, people were asking for more political freedom, for an end of the rule of the security services, for an end of corruption. These were the major demands in the beginning. It all started in the south of Syria. It spread throughout the country because of the bloodshed that the regime used and this live fire that they kept on using on the demonstrators. So by now, the demonstrators are asking for the toppling of the regime. They don't see any future for any dialogue with this regime because of the many deaths. So the main cause now is, the main focus is to topple the regime, but the protest movement itself has nothing to do with religion. Its motivation is political and economical.
So the nature of the protest has changed from one where they simply say, let's reform the system that we have, to let's change the regime. Are there any prospects of regime change if the demonstrators are going up against a well-armed government?
The regime has to change. There's two scenarios for how to change. There is a transformation peaceful process, but there is also the other what could need some years. But the other fractions, they wanted to change the regime right now. And one of the, for example, demands of the protesters is also to stop the violence at the moment in the streets, just to withdraw the tanks from the cities and from the normal civilian places and so on.
But stopping the government, if the government is determined to crush the uprising and the government feels threatened by an uprising that indeed threatens their very existence, as Kristen just described, that is now turned into one of a protest demanding regime change. Now, the regime is not going to accept that. We know that it does not stop at using brute force. We've seen the tanks now roll into Hama. There are great concerns about what's happening there. And when we look at it from outside, we can't help but compare it with other changes we've seen in the Arab world or other movements. We've seen successful change in Tunisia and in Egypt. Michael Stürmer, can you explain to us how the uprising in Syria is different from those other uprisings we've seen in the region?
Well, the simplest explanation is that Syria is a very different country. Egypt is a state with a very old tradition, great pride in this state tradition. Tunisia, where it all started, looks at France. Syria is a very recent invention. Although Syria is mentioned in the Bible, but that's not the Syria of today. A fairly recent invention, and it used to be a, relatively speaking, within the Arab world, a leading country. But that was when the Sunni civilization was predominant. Now, in 1970, the father of Assad toppled the prevailing Sunni elites, and that seems to be one of the grievances here, that a social, religious, political minority, the Alawites probably have about 10 to 12%, in a pretty fractious society, and that's not going to work in the long run. So apart from the very serious grievances, which were of course inspired by Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain probably, in spite of those grievances, there is something underlying the problem, and that makes also the end game so very difficult, and the stakes are now very high. There will be no forgiveness for the Assad clan, and possibly for their allies in the intelligence services, in the police, in the army. So they are forced to fight to the bitter end.
To what degree, Michael Stürmer, is this a conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, or Alawites and Sunnis?
Well, that's really a question which should be directed to the experts around. There is, of course, an overall pattern in the Middle East where you have the Sunni powers, Egypt, it used to be much simpler before the Arab Spring. The Sunni powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, little, very important Jordan, and the Shia crescent. And this is now blurred, but it is part of the pattern.
Okay.
There's also Iran beyond the Arab world.
Very important, playing a role here as well, supporting the Syrian regime. We understand. Salam?
I don't think that the problem is because of the minority is now ruling. The problem of the nature of the system. If there is a democratic system, is no problem if there is a minority who is ruling the whole state. The problem is the repression. The problem of, for example, they rely on military or armed forces to get the orders, not on democratic values. And this is what we want to have.
I mean, the conflict is not a religious one originally. The conflict is politically and economically motivated. The big risk in Syria is, as Michael Stürmer pointed out, that the nature of the regime is a minority regime. So we see Alawites in the leading figures are Alawites in the military, in the secret services. The Assad clan, of course, is Alawi. So we see that whoever uses the violence now against the peaceful demonstrators are mostly Alawites. Well, this is a problem. This bears the risk of, afterwards, revenge against a minority group, although the Sunnis they don't have a confessional religious problem with the Alawites, but they have the problem that these people are now using all this force.
Well, it's interesting. From the government's point of view, Bashar al-Assad's government, he suggests that the uprising is being driven by extremists and, to some degree, religious extremists. Now, we've heard this before also in Libya. This is how Muammar Gaddafi was arguing as well, that he tried to brand the protesters as terrorists, as religious extremists. Is there any truth to that claim?
No, this is a very dangerous game that he plays with the feelings, especially of the minorities, because he paints this big threat of Islamism taking over Syria, and then the minorities, especially Christians, Alawites, and Druze in Syria, they will suffer. They will not have their rights now that are guaranteed under Assad. It's a very dangerous play to game, because in Syria we have a big chance of confessional violence. The model, or the big bad example, is Iraq, neighboring Iraq, because the society in Iraq is pretty much the same. We have Sunnis, we have Shias, we have Kurds, an ethnic minority. So this is the big threat, and this is the big fear of all the minorities. And the regime is playing with these fears to keep them quiet and to keep them off the street. There have been talks, I have to say, there have been talks that in some places single demonstrators have been armed, or that there are groups who are taking advantage of this movement. It's very difficult to know from outside, but we have to mention it here at least.
What about the geographical pattern of the uprising in Syria? Much of the focus right now is on Hama. The government has sent tanks, and the regime has sent tanks into Hama. Estimates are that between over 130 people have been killed there during the past week alone. But that apparently is not the only place where we're seeing an uprising. Where else are we seeing?
No, there's also south of southern of Syria. It started in Daraa, for example. In northeast, the state also in Abu Kamal, for example, Deir ez-Zor. Also northern, close to the Turkish borders. There were a lot of protests in Homs, for example, everywhere. Actually, in Damascus yesterday, many people tried to protest on the streets, but they were directly repressed. And also in Damascus, where yesterday was more than one person was killed from the intelligence services, for example.
I mean, until now, the centers of Damascus and Aleppo, which are the two big cities, were relatively calm. We have seen demonstrators maybe of 50 people, mostly because they're immediately repressed, as you said. But the nature of this uprising is decentral. It's not central.
Yeah.
So this makes it difficult for the regime to cope with it, because it moves every week. The center of the demonstrations moves from the south to the coast, to the north, to the east. Now the focus is on Hama, probably because of the history, but it's just one point and one big city where we've seen protests. And maybe Hama was 3 weeks, throughout 3 weeks, it was said that it was out of government control, because there were no tanks, no military there. So maybe this was a reason now to focus on Hama with this cracking down during the months of
Hama plays a very important role in the collective memory of Syrians because of something that happened there back in 1982. Let's take a look.
In 1982, Syrian President al-Assad was under enormous pressure. The opposition was in revolt, threatening his grip on power. Muslim extremists resorted to violence. Their power base was Hama, a city of 350,000. Assad decided to make an example of them. Airstrikes, heavy artillery, and tanks were used to level the city. Mass executions followed. It's estimated that between 10,000 and 40,000 people were killed. Opposition to the regime was crushed. Assad's position was strengthened. Outside of Syria, indignation over the massacre of Hama was short-lived.
Michael Stürmer, do you see parallels between what happened in Hama in 1982 and what's happening there now?
Well, there are certainly parallels, but the differences, I think, are much stronger. First of all, the drama in Hama, estimates are between 10 and 40,000 dead. We are far from that number. We are far from that number. Second, it had a clear, at least to the outside world, it had a clear religious dimension. The Muslim brothers obviously wanted a different regime. What has not been mentioned yet, the Assad regime is an entirely secular regime. Religion is in the background. So it was a different time also throughout the Arab world. And also the pressure on the regime was fairly mild because all eyes were on Lebanon, 82. All eyes were on Iran, the Khomeini revolution. Here you now have not an open society, but you have a society in which much of what's going on is relayed real time to the outside world, and that makes a big difference. So the whole moral context is different. And of course, Hama has obviously the terror, the trauma of Hama 1982 has gone, and that is also a very important thing.
What about the way the international community responded back then? Apparently there was a brief outcry, but not much beyond that. Now we're seeing a considerable response. Still no one going so far as to say that they're willing to intervene. But on Wednesday, we did get at least a statement from the UN Security Council, not a resolution, but a statement from the Security Council condemning the violence and calling for peace. What about the international reaction? Are we going to see a stronger international reaction here now than we have in the past with regard to Syria, and particularly with regard to what we saw back in 1982?
Actually, it is too difficult now to have the resolution as long as Russia and China stand by Syrian government. It is very clear. But Syrians are expected more from the international community, more support in form of sanctions, for example, in forms of resolutions. They wanted that the case of Syria be referred to the International Crime Court, for example, in La Haye, and that we need the resolution to start this inquiry commission, for example, to pressure more and more on the Syrian government to accept human agencies,
human rights agencies,
to go to Syria and to access to the affected regions and so on. That's what the Syrians actually expected, and what happened until now, it is really under this level.
Well, we're seeing, you mentioned Russia and China. Now Russia, being a traditional ally of Syria in many ways, has apparently begun to soften its position and has also begun to criticize Syria and didn't block the communication coming out of the Security Council. How significant is that?
It is a positive signal just to make more pressure or to put more pressure on the Syrian regime, but it is not very, what we say, promising statement of Russia. Russia will maybe don't repeat this statement or will not strengthen this statement in the future. And the evidence for this that the Council has no resolution until now, and it is a little bit a pity for the Syrians.
I mean, the big problem actually is that the West doesn't have that much influence in Syria in the first place, because Syria is a country that is used to sanctions by the US, and it's used to isolation. The EU isolated Syria between 2005 and 2008, following the events in Lebanon, and 2005, the killing of the ex-premier Rafiq al-Hariri. Yes. And so Syria is used to this kind of isolation. It turned east. It has other partners, other strong allies. So it's not affected that much.
Particularly Iran? Who would be the...
Particularly Iran, especially, yes. But also economically speaking, the Southeast Asia, Russia, China. So they don't depend on Western money, and they don't depend on being good friends with the West in this sense. So the influence compared to Egypt, for example, compared to Yemen.
That's a big difference.
This is a big difference. They all lived on the financial help of the West. Syria is not. They are used to this. They are not impressed by any declarations of the UN Security Council. All these political measures, diplomatic measures, are signals towards the movement in the street. They are signals towards the opposition to say, we are with you, we know what's going on, we support you, but it will not turn anything, or it will not change the behavior of the regime, probably.
So we don't have a resolution coming out of the Security Council yet, and it sounds like it's unlikely that we're going to see one. A resolution would carry sanctions, which, Kristen, you're saying, would not impress the Assad regime anyway. What can we hope to come from the international community that would actually have any influence on developments in Syria at this point? What can we expect?
Well, the international community is a wonderful term, except that it doesn't exist. There are all kinds of forces,
Put it in the
contradictions.
context of NATO and the United Nations Security Council.
Well, first of all, you would expect something to come from other Arab countries.
Yes, the Arab League.
Given the situation as you describe it, that would impress, of course, the rulers of Damascus much more than anything coming from Western Europe.
And the Arab League did stand up with regard to Libya.
I don't think that there will be shivers down Assad's neck when Mrs. Ashton knocks at the door and says, no, no. I think we have lost much of our moral capital, and we have no escalation dominance. We have nothing to throw into the battle except our moral disapproval and except a little more sanctions. We'll not buy your oil. Okay, the oil market is not in a critical state at present, can change overnight, but not for the time being. So there is not very much that can be done. And I think the protesters in Syria, at least, have not voiced a strong demand for outside help. They want moral support, yes. Please be on our side, but don't intervene.
Well, there's a sense, too, that if the protesters were beginning to call for foreign intervention, that would possibly give the government even greater reason to crack down harder than they have. Just before we leave
the Syrian army is a real army. That's not the Libyan thing.
They are very well armed. There's the question about the Arab League. I don't want to leave this alone because it is so critical. It is so essential to the power matrix in this region. Is there any prospect that the Arab League will call for change in Syria?
At the moment, there is no sign that the Arab League will move in this direction. What I wanted to say that economically, Syria is very regional-oriented economy. So if you want to hurt Syrian regime or Syrian economy, you had to pressure on the regional partners, the Gulf state, for example. And Turkey anyway is a little bit make pressure on Syria, but Iran, Gulf state, and other Arab countries.
Interestingly, just as if I may interject, I was looking at the exports from Syria, and the majority goes to Iraq still at this point. The second place is Lebanon. Third place is Germany.
Yeah, and it's all business as usual, bilaterally with the Arab neighbors. We have Lebanese, Jordanian ministers coming to Damascus. We had the Syrian-Iraqi Economic Committee meeting last week, I think. So everything is just continuing business as usual, and nobody interferes really in the political situation inside the country. And this is because in Damascus itself, you can do business as usual, because in the capital, if you go there, it seems like there's no revolution going on, because it's quite under control by the regime still.
Syria seemed for a while to be on the path to political reforms. When Bashar al-Assad took over from his father, he made promises to repeal the state of emergency. And now, even since the UN statement regarding Syria, we've had Assad issue a decree saying that he would recognize political parties and that they would be able to participate in the political process. Is there any prospect of reform from within? Do you see that, Salam?
I think the regime is incredible. These promises are were before, 10 years before, or during the last year or 2 years ago, but there's nothing has happened until now, and this is what makes the people angry on the street. Don't give us promises which actually in the Western media will appear, okay, Assad promised to make the reform, but there's nothing happened.
All window dressing?
Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the greatest minds of all times and a political analyst of the 19th century, described the Ancien Régime in France, and he described the reforms undertaken 15 years before the French Revolution. And he describes what we now call the Tocquevillian moment, which is the most dangerous moment for any dictatorial regime. That is the moment when they have to reform, they understand they have to reform, they want to reform, and then they criticize themselves, the past, and in so doing, they're weakening their own legitimacy. And this is a dilemma which you cannot solve unless you have great confidence and you are a great leader. Now, Assad was trained as a dentist. He wasn't trained as a dictator. He wasn't trained as a great leader. He stumbled into a situation not of his own making. It was a terrible legacy from his father, and he made some nice-sounding promises, It worked for a while because it gave hope, and then those hopes were crushed.
We only have about a minute left. Kristen, what do you see as the prospects? How is this going to play out? Status quo is going to be maintained, or do you see change on the way?
Well, this depends if the people, the majority of the Syrians who are not taking place in the demonstration, if they will switch sides. This will depend. Maybe we have a call for the resignal of Bashar al-Assad from the international community. This would help these people maybe to think, okay, let's switch sides now before standing all in front of the international court. So this would help maybe, and let's see what the Ramadan still brings.
Salam, you have a big stake in the country. You have relatives there, friends there. You're from Syria. Do you see good prospects for change there or not?
No. For change, of course, if the protest movement succeed, maybe it is a positive sign. But if not, it will be very difficult for the people, at least who say something against the regime during the 4 months. Yeah.
What do they want to hear from the international community? What can the international community do? Very briefly.
Real steps, sanctions on the oil and gas.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Michael Stürmer, Kristen Helberg, and Salam Said, thank you very much for joining us, and hope you all will tune in to Deutsche Welle and Quadriga again next week. Do check us out on the internet, by the way, at dwworld.de.